Everyone wants to grow up, to mature. Yet growth, especially spiritual growth, comes only through struggle and sometimes crisis. It's the baby chick trying to break out of the egg. It's the butterfly struggling to escape from the cocoon. It's the child struggling through adolescence towards the promised land of adulthood. But growth doesn't stop with adulthood. It continues on to the day that we die and perhaps beyond, because the call of God is always upward and onward. Jesus commanded his followers to grow spiritually. Be ye therefore perfect or mature, even as your Father in heaven is mature. Paul said that we should grow up into Jesus. And in Romans, he said we should not stop growing until we are conformed to the image of Christ. Such growth comes only by struggle. It's often accompanied by discouragement and despair. Why can't I reach my goal? Why do I have to keep wandering through this wilderness? The path to spiritual growth is a wilderness path. It strongly parallels the path taken by Moses and the children of Israel 3,200 years ago, as they took their exodus from Egypt and entered the burning crucible of the Sinai on their way towards that promised land. Over these next 12 weeks, we're going to be studying the journey to spiritual maturity by tracing the footsteps of Moses. On my last journey through the wilderness, I took a small group of 12 men with me. We camped out, sleeping under the stars and cooking our own food, and we had 2 jeeps with Egyptian drivers and a seasoned Israeli guide. We stopped at strategic places along the way, and I taught the lessons that the children of Israel learned 3,200 years ago. Lessons we need to learn on spiritual maturity. Each week you'll have a chance to join us, not only to listen in, but to actually see where God spoke to those ancient Israelites. But now, come with me across the years to the wilderness. The time, approximately 1,200 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. The place, the Sinai Peninsula, that barren and remote desert which separates Egypt from the promised land of Israel. Into this burning crucible, Moses led the children of Israel. They were on their way, on foot, fleeing the bondage of Egypt where they had spent the last 480 years, to claim their inheritance in a land they had never seen, a land flowing with milk and honey, where the covenant God had made with their ancient ancestor, Abraham, would be fulfilled, a land that is still called by their name, the land of Israel. I'm Jamie Buckingham. I've been in this Sinai for a number of days now, this place that Moses called the great and terrible wilderness. Literally following the footsteps of that band of Israelites as they trekked their way from Egypt towards the promised land. Here I find nature in its rawest form. The Sinai remains today, as it was in the time of Moses, a scorching crucible which melts armies and burns from proud men all sin and selfishness until they are prepared for ministry. Desert is a place of training, a place of preparation. Most of us don't like to train. We prefer to get out on the playing field, and yet it's in the desert that we learn to grow towards spiritual maturity. It's there we learn to throw off everything that hinders us, the sin that does so easily entangle, and we learn to run with perseverance the race that's marked for us. It's there we fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. In my own personal exodus from Egypt, moving toward the Promised Land, I have struggled with spiritual growth. There's a tendency to want to withdraw and become like those hermits of the early centuries, back into caves, and yet God says, move on, move on. And so I've attempted to do that. I went back into the Sinai time and time again, traveling with a group of men, each one of us on our own spiritual journey, believing that if we could follow the footsteps of Moses, that we would be able to find where God intended us to be at the same time, climbing these mountains, moving upward, moving onward, tracing his path. I began my search at the eastern borders of Egypt, a place where the Suez Canal now joins the Gulf of Suez, northern extension of the Red Sea. It was there at a place called the Yam Suf, or Sea of Reeds, that God sent a mighty east wind to blow back the waters and allow Moses to walk through on dry ground. From there, we're going to proceed south, stopping at a place called the Springs of Mara, and learn something of purging. Then we'll move on again towards that wonderful oasis of Elim, where the Bible said that there were 70 palm trees and 12 springs. It's a place of God's filling, a place of God's provision. We'll study how and why Moses brought water from the rock. And we'll climb the mountain at Rephidim, where Moses held up his staff while Joshua led his troops against the fierce Amalekites in the valley below. We'll journey on to Mount Sinai, Jebel Musa, the Arabs call it, the Mountain of Moses, where God gave Moses the law. Along the way, we'll see some exciting places, such as the oldest existing monastery in the world, St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai. It was here, by the way, that Egyptian Premier Anwar Sadat built his desert retreat house. We'll stop at a Bedouin graveyard and talk a little bit about hospitality. There we'll see the tomb of a Bedouin sheikh, and we'll let these strange desert nomads, the Bedouins, fix bread for us, the original matzah, or unleavened bread of the Passover. And we'll wind up, eventually, at Kadesh Barnea in the northern Sinai, where the Israelites learned their final lessons before entering Canaan. I keep asking myself, why do I return to the desert? Why not to the mountains or to the seashore? Why the desert with its scorching sands and craggy mountains? Emerging from the dark night of my own soul several years ago, when it seemed I had almost destroyed myself and my own family, I determined to trace the literal path of those early searchers of promise, returning to the Sinai again and again across these years. I've begun to understand that there is indeed some kind of way through the wilderness, that what Moses did, I can do also. This wilderness still remains a place of purification, a place of preparation, a place where a man can learn to distinguish between the clamoring voices of this world and the often quiet, gentle voice of God. That's why I return. You find the desert really is your friend. There are trails through the desert, a way through the desert, so to speak. A man can stay alive here all of his life if he knows where to find the water and what to eat, and if he's not afraid of making friends of the inhabitants who live here, these strange, warm, friendly Bedouin from a different culture, from a different religion, and yet with their concepts of hospitality who reach out, and if you reach back, they'll accept you as one of their own.
There's no need to be afraid. Man really is afraid only of the unknown. But once you learn the wilderness, once you learn what we call dark is really light, there's no need to fear it anymore.
The secret to understanding the passage through the Sinai are the wadis. The wadis are these huge dry riverbeds which run between the high mountains, crisscrossing the Sinai Peninsula. We left the Gulf of Eilat and turned inland through Wadi Watir, one of 4 major passageways across the Sinai Peninsula. We began to think about the passage of the children of Israel through this same Sinai Peninsula, and especially their first stop at a place called Marah, which were the first springs that the children of Israel saw as they left the Gulf of Suez heading south towards Mount Sinai. The children of Israel, with the springs of Marah behind them, staggered through the desert sands along the Gulf of Suez. Their thirst had returned as the days grew longer and hotter. Slowly, the great procession turned inland, following the directions of Moses, who had been this way many times before.
The desert brings out the very best and the very worst in men. For some reason, it's the place that God has always required his special people to go into. Moses was forced into the desert after his experience with the murdering of the taskmaster, and for 40 years he was in this place, this Sinai. It became a crucible for Moses. Here he was ground into powder, and yet out of that powder God created, or perhaps recreated, a new man. I think about that every time I come to this wilderness place. The mountains tower around the sky like a giant canopy overhead. And yet here, in the midst of all this silence, there's a still small voice, that small voice that spoke to Elijah. It still speaks to me. Perhaps the best word to describe the Sinai is mystery. It's fraught with mysterious experiences. It's very difficult to separate the fable from the truth. It all gets blended together here in this mixture of sand and stone, of stars and sky, and these rugged stone mountains. We started our trek through the plain of Iraqah, which is the great plain that spreads out before the base of Mount Sinai. It was here the children of Israel camped, while Moses, leaving the multitude, went up into the mountain. We came across it in our vehicle and came to the base of Mount Sinai proper, where St. Catherine's Monastery is now located. Interesting history behind St. Catherine's. In the time of the Crusades, when the iconoclasts came through, tearing down all the icons, St. Catherine's was spared. And so it remains even today. Perhaps the most famous monastery in the world, certainly the oldest monastery, which is still in existence. We left St. Catherine's after a brief visit and began the arduous climb up Mount Sinai itself. Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses. It towers almost 7,500 feet above sea level. Climbing from St. Catherine's, we made our way up through St. Stephen's Gate. Again, tradition and fable seem all mixed up together. St. Stephen built this gate with his own hands, a high arch over the steps, to examine all the pilgrims who came up the path to the summit of Mount Sinai. And so St. Stephen, Stephanos, sat beside his gate until he died. His sarcophagus now resides in the charnel house below at St. Catherine's Monastery. The wilderness does not have to be a place of hopeless fear and utter despair. Despite the hard lessons learned, the taste of bitter water, the conflict with self, nature, and desert enemies, it can be a place of tranquil beauty, perfect rest, and warm fellowship with fellow pilgrims. To bypass the wilderness in our journey to the promised land is to bypass God. As our group was climbing Mount Sinai, we spotted far off in the distance a large wooden cross overlooking a deep valley below. As we approached the cross, we saw that far over the edge of the precipice, 2,500 feet below, was St. Catherine's Monastery. Our men were eager to climb the hill, but our Jewish guide reminded us, be careful, keep your eyes on the cross, because if you don't, your feet will surely slip and you'll plummet into the valley below. Perhaps that's God's message to those of us who are wandering in the wilderness. To make sure that our feet don't slip, keep your eye on the cross. I doubt if I return to this place again. It's been exciting, walking the places where Moses walked, meeting the people that still lived here, who are remnants of those ancient Israelites. It's been exciting in a search for God. It's been exciting in an experiment in relationships. But I doubt if I come back again. For all that it's worth, I have found that God does not really reside in desert places. God resides wherever man's heart is turned to him. To come here has been a respite, a time away, but it's not real. And so I must return. I must return to my family. I must return to my friends. I must return to the church that I belong to. I must return to my job. For it's there where God is. It's there where I must live with him and obey his commands. You do not have to come to the Sinai. You do not have to come to the wilderness to find him. True, God has been here, and we still see his footprints in many places. But how much better it is for those who follow his footprints in the place where they live, rather than coming to what used to be holy ground. How much better it is to find him where you are.